Jerry, a horror writer, was in a rut. His last book had tanked. The words refused to come. He needed inspiration, something to get his blood pumping. He craved fear, that primal emotion that resonated with readers. But where to find it? How to manufacture it?
Where can I find it? How do I make it happen?
Jerry paced his apartment, his eyes wild with desperation. The blank page on his laptop mocked him. His usual haunts, the dusty libraries and eerie antique shops, held no charm. He needed something more, something real. An idea struck him, a terrible, brilliant idea. He would confront fear head on. He would go to where it lived, where it breathed, where it whispered on the wind. The old cemetery on the edge of town had always held a morbid fascination for Jerry. Shrouded in mist and legend, it whispered of forgotten tragedies and restless souls. He'd heard the stories, the rumors of strange lights and chilling cries. It was the perfect setting for a horror story. And what better way to tap into its essence than to spend a night within its walls, to immerse himself in the silence of the graves.
It's perfect.
The old iron gates of the cemetery groaned like a dying man as Jerry pushed them open. Rust coated the bars, staining his fingers a sickly orange. He stepped inside, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the cemetery itself were exhaling. Above him, a murder of crows took flight, startled by his intrusion. They circled overhead, their harsh cries echoing through the twilight.
Whoa, this place is something else.
Jerry watched them go, a strange sense of foreboding settling in his gut. He was alone now, utterly alone. He walked deeper into the cemetery, his footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. The headstones, some ancient and crumbling, others more modern and severe, stood like silent sentinels in the gathering gloom. He ran his fingers over one, the inscription worn smooth by time. He wondered about the person buried beneath, their life, their death, their secrets. Jerry found a secluded spot beneath a gnarled oak tree, its branches skeletal against the darkening sky. He set up his makeshift workspace laptop on his knees, thermos of coffee within easy reach. He opened his laptop and stared at the blank screen.
Come on, Jerry, you can do this. Just write.
Then he began to type, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Words poured out of him, dark and twisted, fueled by the eerie atmosphere. He was the story, and the story was consuming him. Hours passed. Jerry lost himself in his writing, the real world fading away. The cemetery, no longer a source of fear, morphed into a warped muse. His fingers danced across the keyboard, fueled by adrenaline and something colder, something he couldn't name. The story flowed, darker and more twisted than anything he'd ever written.
A sudden chill cut through his concentration. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter. The air had grown heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The scent of damp earth intensified, tinged with something metallic, something like blood.
Jerry tried to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. He took a swig of coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to settle his nerves. He glanced at his watch. 3 a.m. The witching hour. A nervous laugh escaped his lips.
Stupid superstition. I'm a horror writer, for God's sake. I thrive on this stuff.
Yet he couldn't ignore the feeling of dread that had him firmly in its grip. A low sound like wind whistling through a crypt broke the silence. Jerry's head snapped up. He scanned the area, his heart pounding against his ribs. The trees swayed gently, but there was no wind, just the oppressive stillness of the graveyard.
Hello?
His voice sounded small, lost in the vastness of the cemetery. Only silence answered him. He tried to convince himself it was his imagination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, a primal fear began to bloom in his chest. He could have sworn he heard whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the graves around him. Murmurs of anger, of resentment. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his story forgotten. He was no longer the observer, the creator of fear. He was now the one being observed, the one being hunted. The ground beneath him grew cold, the temperature plummeting. A wave of nausea washed over him. He was no longer alone. He knew it with a certainty that chilled him to the bone.
A low growl, guttural and filled with malice, erupted behind him.
Jerry spun around, his blood turning to ice. A figure materialized, its eyes glowing with an eerie green light. It was tall and skeletal, draped in a decaying burial shroud. Terror seized Jerry. He scrambled backward, tripping on a root. He fell, landing hard on his back. The laptop tumbled from his lap, the screen going dark. He was at the mercy of whatever lurked in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him. They were angry, and they were coming for him. The skeletal figure glided closer, its bony fingers reaching out, the tips trailing wisps of ethereal smoke. Jerry scrambled back, fear lending him a surge of adrenaline. He scrambled to his feet, backing away from the apparition.
Stay back.
Jerry's voice cracked, barely a whisper in the oppressive silence of the graveyard. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. The figure stopped, its glowing green eyes boring into Jerry's soul. Then it spoke, its voice a hollow rasp, like stones grinding together.
You dare intrude upon our eternal rest?
The voice echoed around him, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jerry felt a chill run down his spine, colder than the grave he was sure awaited him. This was no hallucination. This was all too real. As the skeletal figure spoke, other figures began to emerge from the shadows. Glowing eyes like embers in the darkness surrounded Jerry. He was trapped, encircled by the restless dead. Whispers escalated into groans, then moans, then a chorus of voices, each filled with anger and resentment. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, a suffocating miasma that clawed at Jerry's throat. He coughed, his eyes watering. He felt a hand, cold and clammy, grip his arm. He cried out, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened.
We do not welcome the living here.
Jerry recoiled, his skin crawling at the touch of icy breath on his neck. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and utterly powerless against the spectral horde that was closing in. Panic surged through Jerry, threatening to overwhelm him. He had to get out, had to escape this nightmare, but his legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by terror. He looked from one spectral face to another, searching for a flicker of mercy in their hollow eyes.
I didn't mean any disrespect. I'm just a writer. I came here for inspiration.
The skeletal figures let out a chorus of hollow laughter, the sound chilling him to the bone.
Inspiration?
The first figure, the apparent leader of this ghostly gathering, stepped closer. Jerry could see the faint outline of a man within the skeletal frame, a man who had once lived, breathed, dreamed.
You would use our suffering, our eternal torment, for your own amusement.
No, you misunderstand. I wanted to tell your stories to give voice to the forgotten.
Jerry shook his head frantically, realizing the depth of his transgression. He was grasping at straws, but he had to try. He had to make them understand.
Stories have power. They can preserve our memory or condemn us to oblivion. Choose your next words carefully, writer. Your fate hangs in the balance.
The skeletal figure's words hung in the air, heavy as tombstones. Jerry's mind raced, grappling with the impossible situation. He was no longer facing a blank page, but a judging panel from beyond the veil. His story, his very life, depended on the words he chose next.
I want to tell the truth.
Jerry began, his voice trembling but resolute. He looked into the hollow eyes of the figure before him, sensing the weight of countless untold stories pressing down on him.
I want the world to remember who you were, what happened here.
The other figures shifted, a wave of murmuring whispers rippling through the ghostly assembly. Jerry pressed on, his voice gaining strength as he spoke.
Your lives, your deaths, they deserve to be heard. Not exploited, not sensationalized, but honored.
The lead figure remained silent, its skeletal head tilting slightly as if considering his words, but the other figures grew restless. Their moans intensified, a cacophony of anguish and rage. The air crackled with energy, and Jerry felt a surge of terror course through him. He had to escape, had to get away before they changed their minds.
I understand now, I'll go, but I'll never forget what I've seen here tonight.
As he turned to run, a chorus of shrieks erupted behind him. The figures surged forward, their forms shimmering and shifting, reaching for him with grasping claws. Jerry didn't look back. He just ran, blindly, desperately, through the maze of tombstones and mausoleums. The cemetery seemed to twist and turn around him, the paths shifting and changing like a nightmare labyrinth. He could hear the spectral horde close behind, their cries echoing through the night. Fear lent him speed, propelling him forward through the darkness. He could see the faint outline of the cemetery gates in the distance, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. But as he ran, he tripped, stumbling over an unseen root. He fell hard, the impact knocking the breath out of his lungs. As he lay there, gasping for breath, he saw him standing over him. The lead figure, his skeletal face illuminated by an eerie green glow. The other figures began to gather around him, their forms coalescing from the shadows, their eyes burning with a cold fire.
You cannot escape us, writer. You have glimpsed the truth, the pain, the anger that lingers here. You will carry that with you, always.
Jerry woke up with a gasp, his body drenched in a cold sweat. He was in his own bed, the morning light filtering through his blinds. The cemetery, the spirits, it all felt like a fever dream. But as he sat up, he noticed something. His laptop was open, displaying the last page of his story. The words he had written in the cemetery were all there. They were more powerful, more chilling than anything he had ever written. He had been given a terrifying glimpse into the realm of the dead. The experience had changed him, left an indelible mark on his soul. He knew he would never look at a cemetery or a blank page the same way again. He had sought inspiration in the darkness, and he had found it. But he had also found a profound respect for the dead. He would continue to write his horror stories, but they would be different now. They would be infused with the weight of his experience. He had learned a valuable lesson in the graveyard that night. Some stories are best left untold, and some places are best left undisturbed. The dead had their peace, and he had his.